morning, everybody. Welcome back to those of you who were here yesterday, which I think was most of you. So yesterday I talked about the book, and some of you have bought it. And one of the things that I also did alongside the book was get a short movie made of just under 3 minutes, because I was told that the youth of today don't like reading, they like watching, and it's got to be super short. And what's been great is that this has actually been used as a resource as well. So I've been in contact with some schools who've got some copies, and the South African educational program that works with some of the low-income schools have also sort of sent it to some of them. And so I'm going to start with this short movie because it kind of draws nicely on the story I told yesterday and kind of introduces us to the lessons I want to share today.
Day 0. One city and a record-breaking drought. How does a city come close to running out of water? Early in 2018, Cape Townians panicked at the prospect of Day 0, the day when taps would run dry and they would have to queue for water rations. Looking back, it's important to understand what happened and what lessons were learned in adapting to a climate crisis at municipal level. The city of Cape Town had made plans for an increase in water demands, but never anticipated such a 3-year-long, one-in-a-century event. Dams provide the city's water, so restricting water consumption was an essential first step. As Day 0 approached, attempts were made to supplement water supplies with groundwater, desalination, and recycling. While city managers made significant efforts to avert a crisis, it soon became clear that water from these new sources wouldn't become available fast enough. Residents also had to urgently reduce their water usage, but they needed direction. The city's mayor created a team of key players, extending responsibility for the crisis to the entire city management, instead of leaving it as the sole responsibility of the water department alone. The citywide scale of the problem demanded responses from other players. For example, input from national government was needed on water restrictions, but this was slow and insufficient. Officials across a range of departments had to work together in ways they hadn't before and answer citizens' needs and queries. Cape Town's residents were often in the dark about details on restrictions and other plans. But because things were changing so quickly, the city was hesitant to share information on their response. When the drought finally broke, it seemed that Cape Town did have the capacity to collectively face such an enormous crisis. Within 2 years, citizens halved their water consumption, and ultimately, the city's water supply was not cut. Day 0 may have been called off, but it continues to be a reminder that many poorer Cape Townians live in a perpetual state of scarcity, collecting water from standpipes and sharing communal toilets. The city needs new capacities of leadership, a better understanding of climate change scenarios, and more attention to future planning. Water was previously seen as being dependent on physical infrastructure. It is now clear that it needs to be seen as a governance issue, an economic issue, and a social issue too.
Yeah, short and sweet. So, any comments or questions about the movie before we start?
Get quick.
That's all they want, the youth of today.
Very effective.
Okay, good. Yeah, but also, I mean, it was very frustrating for me because really one of the biggest lessons I came out of the drought with was how complex it was and how hard it was to understand, because there really were so many different points and parts. And so trying to explain it in something short is very challenging. Yes?
Just on the first line at the end, it's also a communication issue, which is what we're addressing here.
Absolutely. Good. So today I want to kind of stand back from the story I told and really unpack the lessons that were learned. And so what I did from my work is look at all the things that were emerging and put them into 4 groups, 4 areas to look at. Just to say that movie is on the website of the book, so it's very easily available there if you want to watch it again. And so you don't have to read the lessons that are in the small print because we're going to get to those, but just the idea was that there were 4 sort of main different areas. Again, hard to group them because many are cross-cutting, but that we needed to look at strengthening governance. We need to look at taking more of a systems approach. We need to think about data, expertise, and communication. And we need to focus on actively building an adaptive city. What does it mean to have a city that can adapt? And all of this contributes to building an adaptive, water-sensitive city. So one of the things that when I shared, so there was this nice sort of 6-page briefing note with these lessons, and I was invited by the National Treasury to speak at something called the Cities Budget Forum, where all the municipalities, not all the municipalities, all the big metros, 8 of them across the country, come to think about things such as budget. And one of the reasons why this was very exciting for me is I often work in the environmental space, and so sharing it with the Cities Budget Forum and the people who are in charge of city budgets was really important to make sure that people in other metros are thinking about these issues not only as environmental issues, but as central to the functioning of cities, which really we learned in Cape Town very clearly. And one of the officials at the City of Cape Town actually took my briefing note and she created this graphic because she thought it was very useful for their team. So these are the same 12 lessons that we'll go through. So the first one is about strengthening governance. And I said here the lesson was to build systems and relationships of mutual accountability for effective water management between spheres of government. And what I mean here is that we have a system of spheres of government in South Africa rather than tiers. So it's not supposed to be a hierarchical thing, local is at the bottom, then provincial and national. There are overlapping spheres where each different sphere has different sets of responsibility. But the National Department of Water and Sanitation is very important in providing bulk water and services that go with that. It's very important in managing groundwater. And unfortunately, as I mentioned, there are some significant capacity issues at the National Department. And so when the City of Cape Town wanted to introduce restrictions, they went to national government and said, we want to introduce restrictions. And normally what happens is the national government says, okay, the City of Cape Town has this level restrictions. But the city became so frustrated because national government didn't respond in time that the city had to go ahead and say, we're going ahead with whatever level restrictions. And that is legally fine, but there were issues where they really wanted to do things properly, but because of the lack of response, that was hard. I mentioned yesterday water use licenses, which are really important when bigger companies, buildings, areas want to put in place their own water treatment systems. And the National Department did improve in terms of their timing on licenses. Normally, I think is sort of a 90-day period they say they'll respond in, and they did reduce that in many cases to 30 days. So that was good. But there were a lot of questions around licensing. What can you do? What can't you do? And so this whole crisis really has highlighted some of the questions, both for municipalities and national government, in terms of how do you support people who are going ahead and putting in their own water systems? What are the requirements that need to be in place? And so the City of Cape Town has developed their own alternative water use guidelines because they felt that there wasn't anything at the national level to help share with citizens. We talked a bit about groundwater, and that really was a challenge because it is a national competency, but during the drought, the city really needed to draw on its groundwater resources and think about that going forward as a means of diversification. And there's a lot of uncertainty around how the city then goes forward when it's a national responsibility. One of the things that also happened was for the drilling of the monitoring of the boreholes, the City of Cape Town, everybody who puts in the large-scale boreholes needs to get an environmental impact assessment done. And that can take a long time. It can take, a few years sometimes. And so they did speed that up. They did do it as thoroughly as they could, so it doesn't mean that they didn't do it, but they were allowed to speed up that process. Alien vegetation and clearing. This really was a big issue that I think the drought did a lot to highlight. And as I'm sure you all know, alien vegetation in South Africa takes a lot of our water. And it's really frustrating because a lot of it goes to these trees instead of coming into the water system. And so again, because for the city of Cape Town, so much of the aliens are beyond the city's boundaries, the city doesn't have much responsibility for clearing those or ability to do that. So provincial government and national is responsible for that, but they've been falling behind recently and really hadn't kept up with the clearing as had been kind of laid out. And so I think there was a lot of work from the sort of SANBI's, the South African National Biodiversity Institute, WWF, looking at these issues around aliens and how much water this was taking, and actually how this is one of the most cost-effective solutions to actually cut down alien trees. And what is great is that one of the good things that's come out of this has been something called the Cape Town Water Fund. Has anybody here heard of it? So a really exciting initiative because it's happened in other places in the world, and the public and private sector come together to look at securing water. And what's happened in the Western Cape is this Greater Cape Town Water Fund with support from sort of big business, also national government, Department of Water, national government, Department of Environment, the provincial government, the city government, and they've got a big program going on now to clear aliens in the catchment to secure more water. So I think a very good outcome, both in terms of just physically having more water, but in terms of partnerships, new ways of working, and in thinking long-term about an area and benefit for all. And then another issue that really was important is we talked about the 6 dams yesterday, and these 6 dams are outside the city boundaries, and that's what supplies Cape Town with its water. And for the whole Western Cape system, 60% of the water comes to the city of Cape Town, 25% is used by agriculture, 10% is used by small towns. My maths isn't quite right, and about 10% to evaporation, so I think small towns use a bit less. So the city of Cape Town really uses the majority of that water, but it is for the Western Cape region. And so these dams and the water in the dams are managed by a steering committee that is led by the National Department of Water and Sanitation. And the steering committee had met, but unfortunately when we kind of delved into it during the drought and the city was very concerned about the water, there was really a sense that the data and the modelling that had been done for the Western Cape catchment wasn't quite up to what it should have been. The data was maybe not recent enough. There were some discussions around the consultants who'd done the modelling that maybe weren't the ones that knew the best, and now the consultants who know a lot about it, Oricon, or the change their name now again, have come back in to be part of that modelling, and I know that the modelling team now is working very closely with my colleagues in the Climate Systems Analysis Group to get the latest climate change scenarios. So because of the drought, they have realised that they weren't in a good place and have really made significant improvements about the modelling of the catchment and understanding what is going on. The other thing that I talked about yesterday was really important in terms of enforcing restrictions. So the National Department is supposed to enforce the restrictions. They hadn't done that in the years before, which made the City of Cape Town very concerned. So if you've got a national department responsible for something, the city and your municipal government relies on that, that's where this mutual accountability comes in. You need to be able to rely on them. If they put restrictions in place, they need to enforce them. And I've heard that there actually are some quite important technical advances that have been made from the Berg River, for instance, where the farmers now, it's monitored. So you can no longer say, I'm using X amount of water and you're using Y, because there's a flow meter that says exactly how much you're taking, and so the department can actually now shut off abstraction if people have abstracted too much. So there has been progress on this, but it definitely still is an area of challenge where further work is needed to clarify roles and responsibilities and improve on that. So one of the other areas of governance that is really important, and I linked to this quite often yesterday, is this idea of horizontal or transversal management between departments in the city. And what's interesting is that in many ways the drought crisis was a disaster, and so we have a disaster management department in the city, and so one would expect them to be quite involved. And they were in some ways, and they identified the drought quite early on in a way that showed that they were on top of things, they were concerned about water levels. But I know from previous work I've done sort of 10 years ago looking at flood risk in Cape Town that the staff in disaster management feel quite frustrated because they don't feel they have a lot of say in the political system and the bureaucratic system of the city. And so that's made it hard for them to get their voices heard. But also when it came to disaster planning, which was very important, it was clear that the disaster management had some skills that were great in terms of logistics and planning, but didn't necessarily have the skills and capacity to think about planning for a disaster at a city scale that had cascading risks. And so that's when that sort of more senior team from across the city came together to think about the disaster plan. And they realized that they had to do quite a lot of work to think about how to manage a disaster at a city scale. So I think that lesson has clearly been learned, but there is a sense that there's maybe not sufficient capacity for this scale of disaster planning. And the strategic thinking around it as opposed to the sort of logistics. Again, the fact that the mayor prioritized the drought early in 2017 was important, and she really took it up to the city level, which I think was very important from a sense of seeing this as a citywide crisis rather than something that the water department is responsible for. And then it moved back to the Department of Water in early 2018. And so, yes, it has some good parts, but it also had some challenges. And people in the Department of Water felt very frustrated because they felt they were the experts in this field. Decisions have been taken away from them now to a group who doesn't know a lot about water. Yes, they might be able to think about city budgets, but what do they know about water planning? And so it did create some tensions. But because there was such importance placed on the drought, and it was such a priority in the city, there were so many new relationships that were built between departments that hadn't been there before. So senior people of departments now suddenly were working with senior people in other departments that they didn't even know before. And one of the people I interviewed said, actually, this was the best time to be working in the city because suddenly they could get things done. Other departments were responding to them. This was somebody from the water department. When they put in a request, people wanted to work with them, whereas before it was quite frustrating to get things out of other departments. So that was interesting, and it has built new relationships. And then the one sort of positive thing that's come out of it is this new water strategy that the city has, that really has been a collaborative process of pulling people together to think about what it means to think about a water-sensitive city going forward. And so when the strategy came out and we had some events here at UCT, some of the criticism was, but how are you going to do it? And the city's response was, it's a strategy document to lay out what we want to do. Now we need to think about implementation. So they're in that phase of putting together the implementation plans, which is going to be the important part, because often in South Africa we have these wonderful policies, very progressive, but how you implement them and enforce them is really the challenge. The third and last area for governance is about strengthening partnerships. And this is something I feel very strongly about, and I've done a lot of work in, because I really feel, and there's a lot of evidence globally for this, that if you engage people, they're going to be part of the solution. They're going to feel as though they have something to offer, they're going to feel invested in it, and unfortunately, the city of Cape Town has got quite a good reputation for not doing that. The city, there's a lot of capacity and they know what they're doing and they get on and do it. In many ways that's great, but we are seeing this move towards a more collaborative approach, and we need to embrace that and think about how we can do that. And it's quite a vulnerable position to put yourself in, and I watched the city go through this process during the drought, because at the beginning it was like, we've got this, we're fine, and then it was like, we don't have this because we can't do it alone. There was no way the city could do it alone. And so they had to shift, And it's a tricky thing to do when you want to show that you're still in charge and have power and trust us, but actually we're not quite sure how this is going to play out and we need to work collaboratively. So there were a lot of lessons learned. There were some really lovely stories about key individuals. For example, I told the story yesterday about the person from the National Department of Water, the person who sits in province, who had those personal relationships with farmers from 30 years, and that was really important. There were also some people in disaster management who had very good relationships between the province and the city in that area, and so they could work together, where historically there have often been a lot of tensions between the city of Cape Town and provincial government. There were also some very interesting intermediaries who played an important role. So I'm not sure if any of you have heard of Green Cape or EDP, which is the Economic Development Partnership. And these are NPOs that get a lot of money from government, but are outside government so that they can be more flexible. So Green Cape gets money, and EDP both get money from the province and from the city, and they work a lot on issues of economic development, business support, etc. And Green Cape played an amazing role during the drought. So, for example, when plumbers were facing a whole lot of challenges because everybody wanted to put grey water systems in, etc., Green Cape would pull together a list of resources for plumbers on how to do that. They'd also convened a lot of the businesses because the businesses really felt very frustrated at the beginning of the drought. They didn't know what was going on, they didn't know what it meant for their business, they couldn't get stuff out of the city, and so Green Cape was really that intermediary that held that space. They produced a lot of documentation, they held a lot of workshops, and through the process, they really strengthened the city's relationship with businesses. It took time and there were a lot of frustrations, but at the beginning of the drought, the city of Cape Town didn't really know how to contact many of the businesses who were in the area. And they realized that it was a real problem. When you have a crisis, you need to know who your people are and how you get hold of them. Similarly, on a different note, EDP worked with more vulnerable communities. How do you get hold of vulnerable communities? Who are vulnerable communities? Should the city be saying that, or how do you work with local neighborhood groups who can then help you to identify those who are going to be most at threat if the water is shut off? So that was really important. WWF, Worldwide Fund for Nature, played a really important role. I'm sure some of you might have seen their green files that were released on how to save water and a lot of interesting facts about water that was really important. They also have quite a lot of experience working on water-related issues, including groundwater-related issues, and so the city drew on that advice quite heavily, which was important. And then I talked yesterday about the Section 80 committee that I was on, and this is from a kind of meeting of the Section 80 committee. There's Kevin Winter, and there's the head of Green Cape, where the city drew on experts from outside of the city to reflect on what they were doing. And so partnerships were important, and they sort of built up during the drought with business and strengthened, but my feeling is really that there was not sufficient engagement with civil society from the city's perspective. And the city becomes quite defensive because when they start to engage the public has so many different opinions, and then they need to put something in place. But I really feel we need to move more to that model, and we need to have opportunities for engagement with civil society. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about one of my projects that looks at working with civil society. And so in the city's water strategy, which I've mentioned, they state a lot of things that are great on paper, but again, it'll be very interesting to see what happens in practice. So they say the city's commitment in the context of a whole of society approach. The city will adopt a collaborative approach in implementing the strategy. Collaborative relationships are based on trust, and trust is built where there is transparency and mutual accountability, and where stated intentions of all partners are consistently translated into actions. I'm really looking forward to seeing this happen. Engaging citizens in society, the city will endeavour to create an enabling environment in order to be responsive to citizen-led water initiatives. The city will continue to work with social partners and collaborative intermediary organisations, work with research institutions, NGOs and neighbourhood organisations, and have established processes for documenting community water needs, perceptions and attitudes. And then they talk about effective partnering. A partnering approach enables joint problem identification, co-design and co-implementation of solutions, joint monitoring and evaluation, and shared learning and adaptation. So this is amazing stuff for the city to put down on paper. So I'm really excited, and my work really feeds into this. So I have got a project that I've been doing over the last year where I'm saying to the city, this is what you said you want to do, here's our project and work, think with us so that we can trial it, we can experiment to see how this might work. And so the project's called Community Resilience in Cape Town, and we've used something called the Sense Maker methodology. So this is a toolkit to study lived experience where we collect stories. So we don't just want to know what the problems are, we want to know what it's like to live with challenges on a daily basis. And the respondents are asked to attach meaning to their story. So I don't interpret their story and say, this person couldn't contact the counsellor, therefore it means the counsellors are never available. They interpret the story and their response, and I'll show you a bit more about that. And we developed this with a group called the Western Cape Water Caucus. And they are very much a kind of citizen, bottom-up advocacy group, consisting mainly of people living in low-income settlements and informal settlements. And then we had some colleagues at Stellenbosch who'd used the Sense Maker tool before. And so an important part of this was feedback to the community around how these stories were shared. And for us, this was a very good example of community-generated data. The city is saying they now want to have community-generated data. Well, here's some community-generated data, and this year we're going to explore how to take it forward with the city. So people were asked to share their stories and represent their story with a title and an emoticon, and were asked a whole lot of questions about their story. And so, for me, as a researcher who normally does qualitative research with smaller numbers, say 20, 30 people, interviews, etc., this method was really exciting because it's about combining qualitative and quantitative research. So it's about a story that somebody shares, but then that person signifies their story, says what it means to them, and you collect lots of shorter stories, and so we collected 300 stories. The Western Cape Caucus members were the researchers, and so we did quite a lot of training because one of the things they said is, as an activist group in Cape Town, they actually want skills as researchers themselves. And so they were able to access people in their own communities, collect stories in their environments. And so all they were asked to do when somebody was approached was tell a story about water that you've experienced, and it can be either good or bad. And so when I talk about signifying, the person then has to say, in your story and resolving water problems and the way you've captured in the story, did it require bypassing the law, working through informal channels, or working within the law? Because actually part of what we were seeing is that so many people needed to bypass the law to get things done. So they have a water management device, and the city's put that in, and then it starts leaking. They contact the city, nobody comes, they have no water, 2 weeks go by, they contact the city again, and so then they get a local plumber to come and fix it so that they can get water again, but that's illegal because you're not allowed to tamper with it. So there are so many challenges with it, with water access in informal areas. And you can see that many people felt that they work within the law, others work through informal channels, but capturing this information and sharing it with the city is important. And we had a really great workshop at the end of last year with a number of people from the city who were really excited about this work. And I'm just going to read the middle story where somebody said, our government is not caring about the people. Some of them, their water are closed. When they go to councillors, there's no follow-up. The water is leaking and they go to temporary houses to get water. Water meters are installed without contacting the community. So there's a lot of frustration, and the City of Cape Town does do a user survey every year, and they did one last year, and they speak to thousands of people, so it's very widely they get lots of different opinions, but it's quite quantitative. And we want to get the stories behind, the lived experiences, be able to share that. And the city of Cape Town was very interested in these stories. They wanted to be able to hear these stories, but they haven't had a way of collecting it yet. So one of the things I mentioned is feeding back to the community. So this is Grace at the top left here. She lives in Dunoon, and we had a workshop in Dunoon to share what our findings were with the people who'd responded and others in Dunoon. And this is just outside our workshop venue. This is sewage flowing into the street. There's a terrible situation in Dunoon. And people just want their story heard. And yes, there are a lot of challenges, and it's great to have officials explain why it's hard to address some of them, but it's also great when you can start to see some of the problems that might be resolved if there's a different way of doing things. And so I'm really excited about this work going forward, because I think this is one of the big challenges the city's facing. And they've said they want to do this, and they're looking into how they might do it. So going forward, I think hopefully we'll see some innovation and exploration around this area. Area 2, data, expertise and communication. So what was clear is it's really important to understand the local water system. Where is the water coming from? Who's using what? At the beginning of the drought, the city of Cape Town didn't have a very good sense of who all the big water users were, how they were using water when. Kevin Winter, somebody at UCT who works on water, said it was surprising how little information UCT or the city knew about what UCT's water use was. As the drought sort of progressed, things have been put in place to understand that better. But having data about water use, where your water's coming from, is really important. Also, sharing information about the water situation to build public trust. So we saw this, that there was not a lot of public trust. Slowly, towards the end of 2017, more information was shared. That was really important, helped people to have an idea of what was going on. The dashboard was shared, the green dot map that I talked about yesterday, and some of you would have seen, where it showed those households using 6,000 or less litres per month. Well done to them. They've really made an effort to save water. Those using 6,000 to 10,500, great, that's still good, but the ones with no dots, instead of trying to say they definitely were using above, they said it was, hard to know. Some of them there might be no data, some of them they might be using above, but it gave you a sense of, well, my area, how are people saving? Let's think about it. And some of the work that the behavioral economists have done really talk about the importance of your community and group, and if you get a bill showing how much water you use in comparison to your neighbours or those in the street, then you want to try and improve that. So there's a lot around thinking about behavioural use. And what was interesting to me is the city of Cape Town doesn't actually have experts on sort of behavioural economics within the city, whereas the provincial government has a whole group of people who are experts in that, thinking about behavioural change. And so the city has worked quite a lot with behavioural economists outside the city, which is really important. But going forward, do we need to have more of those kind of capacities within municipalities to be thinking about how we make changes in these areas? And then it was clear that external input was very important. The city got information both from international experts, some really, top people who know how to think about cities and crises, who know how to think about groundwater, who think about desalination, who came in. And Green Cape would often be the place where they were housed. So Green Cape had a groundwater expert there for 3 months and somebody who worked on desalination, getting a whole lot of information together so that the city then was able to say, well, what is best practice internationally? What are we doing? How do we think about our local case? And think about moving forward. But also the importance of external people inside South Africa who have a lot of valuable information. A lot of people were saying, well, I could help, how do I even get in touch with the city? And one of the things that the city, particularly the sort of senior people said, is so many people were coming to them saying, this is how we can help you. And actually it takes a lot of time and effort to respond to all of those. So figuring out a way to engage with those who you really want to engage and say to others, sorry, we can't engage at the moment, is a really important part of crisis, because you need that external input, but the time and resources to manage all of that was a big challenge. So the third area is to take a systems approach, and this became clear during the crisis, and what was clear is that the city had been relying on dams, as we said before. Surface water, they had the majority of the water there. And to have a robust system, you need to think about other parts of the water system. Like we said yesterday, you need to also think about stormwater. You need to think about trying to support sustainable urban drainage. Water running through the soil, A, being cleaned, B, also going back into the groundwater. How do you think about the system as a whole? And there has tended to be an engineering focus to water supply and focusing on that surface water, but you also need to think about your different users. How are they using water? Where are your different users? And that needs to be more integrated in your response. Create a robust network system of water supply. Cape Town's pipes and infrastructure is old, and one of the things they realized is if they could get their infrastructure up to a better standard before crisis, it really would help. Because otherwise, during a crisis, when you have bursts, etc., that's very precious water. And so ensuring that your system is robust before is really important. And then recognizing the limitations of the current financial model for water. Actually, when the city did some of their sums, they realized they weren't recovering the full cost of water. They were subsidizing some of that because the city has to pay for all the water that goes from the dam to our taps. And it's a tricky thing in a city where we have high levels of inequality and many people who can't afford water. So we do have cross-subsidization, where those of us who can afford to pay for water should be paying a bit more so that we can subsidize the water of those who are unable to pay. But one of the things that has been put in place since the drought, I'm not sure how many of you have noticed on your water bills, it changed from just getting charged for the amount of water, and now there's a fixed charge. And so that fixed charge is around 50, 60 rand, and it's based on the diameter of the pipe on your property. Well, I think my fixed charge is 60 rand. Yours is 100. Okay, maybe your pipe's slightly bigger than mine. And so the idea is that you're then paying for the service, because yes, you might be collecting grey water and getting your own water, but you're still flushing it down the system, you're still wanting to turn on the tap at times, and actually you need to pay for the possibility that you're going to do that, even if you are off the grid. And if you're totally off the grid, then you can shut off your system and not pay for it. But it also is good in terms of saying, okay, this property is paying a fixed charge. Some people argue it would be more equitable if you paid your fixed charge based on rates. So your property rates are quite a good indication of affluence, and so higher rates people could possibly pay more. And so obviously there's a lot of backlash against that because people don't want to pay more, but there are discussions around how you make paying for water sustainable. And one of the things the city has started to do is also look outside government for big sort of international grants to fund things like desalination plants. And the water fund is a good way of showing how international sort of investment can also be used to help build a more sustainable water system. And so the last area is to build the adaptive capacity of a city. And part of that is developing a water-sensitive city vision, and I'll show that on the next slide, so I'll get to that next. But integrating climate change into water planning is really important. And it was clear during the Cape Town drought that the city and national government hadn't considered climate change scenarios sufficiently. They hadn't looked at those future scenarios and thought about what does this mean. And yes, it's challenging because often these scenarios are on a longer time scale, to 2050, to 2100, but they show variability, and that needs to be integrated in the planning for water. And so, as I said earlier, it's exciting to see that a lot of work over the last 2 years has been done towards this, and thinking about what it means both to integrate climate change into your demand planning and into the future planning going forward. And then there's also the need to strengthen leadership and the capacity to enable flexible adaptive decision making. This is quite a hard thing to do, and the Resilience Department in the City of Cape Town has actually taken this on board, and one thing that they've done to try and support this is do these simulations. And so what happens is they've had one on a sort of cyber attack where you do a simulation. This is standard practice in big companies, but the city of Cape Town had never done it before. So how do you respond in a cyber attack? What would you do? Who would you call? And then you have a chance to reflect. What happened? How did we work together, etc. So they've done a number of those. They also did one for a large heat event. What would happen if there was a heat wave? How would people respond? And so they're trying to support that kind of work. But it's also a hard thing to do in a city government environment where there are a lot of rules and regulations, and sometimes it's quite hard to be flexible. And one of the things we saw at the intersection of politics and technical is that a lot of the technical experts wanted to do certain things, but because of the politics around the time and Patricia DeLille being so in charge and in control, they were afraid they'd lose their job the next day, and so they felt that it was quite hard to speak very honestly and openly about what they really thought should happen sometimes. So that politics technical mix can be quite problematic at times, and I think people found it quite challenging during the drought, although it also was this opportunity that the politicians really took it to a higher level and engaged with citizens. So it has its pros and cons. And so this was just when I pulled together all of the lessons into what does it mean to think about an adaptive water-sensitive city. It means we need to work across national, provincial and city boundaries and work together. And we need to make sure that leadership and capacity is strengthened across all of these areas. We need to make sure that climate change is integrated into planning. We need to work across the stakeholders in our system who often are not sufficiently engaged, and these partnerships are really important for multiple reasons. And we need to make sure we are building our data so that we can be a city that responds adaptively and flexibly when needed. So the last 3 slides I want to share are about thinking a bit about resilience, and I don't want to go into these in detail, but just to say that in the socio-ecological systems thinking world, where it really does come out as sort of biology and sort of systems thinking from that perspective, where there was the need to recognize the whole system, and then there was the need to think about the social elements of that, and that we are all connected and we need to think about these as a system. So how do we build resilience? They have a number of principles: maintaining diversity and redundancy, managing connectivity, managing slow variables and feedbacks, the things that change quite slowly over time versus the shocks and stresses.
Excuse me, what do you mean by redundancy there?
Cool. So we are going to get to, I'll get to an example of redundancy for Cape Town, which is helpful. So what they're saying is that actually, if you only rely on the dams, then if the dams fail, you have nothing to back up. So actually having another water supply might seem redundant, but during a crisis can be very important.
Supply redundancy, not staff redundancy.
Yes. Redundancy in the system as not in your staff. Encourage, foster complex adaptive systems thinking, which is thinking about your system and how things, different parts are changing. Encouraging learning, broadening participation, and promoting polycentric governance. And what polycentric governance means is that it's not just one organization responsible for the decisions. There are different nodes, groups, actors who have different roles and responsibilities, and then you get a more resilient system. So what I wanted to give you a sense of is this field of socio-ecological systems that has a very strong focus on that. And then Cape Town, I'm not sure if any of you heard, we launched our resilience strategy in November last year. And the Resilience Department is a new department in the city of Cape Town. It's only been around for 2 years. But it's been great during the drought to see how the Resilience Department has worked with the Water Department, has really been thinking about some of these complex systems thinking concepts and bringing them into the water strategy. They were very evident to me in the water strategy. This was a way of thinking that supported participation, learning, flexibility, things like that. And the city of Cape Town has thought about resilience very differently to the socio-ecological thinking people. And I'm going to read this for you because this didn't come out very clearly. And so they talk about 5 pillars of building a resilient Cape Town. a compassionate, holistically healthy city, a connected, climate adaptive city, a capable job creating city, a collectively shock ready city, and a collaborative forward looking city. So really nice principles to think about, and it's really worth looking at this resilience strategy, because what they've done is they've looked at a lot of the activities that the city's already doing, but they've also pulled out a number of things that they think they could push going forward, and they are looking at environmental, climate change related things, but they're also looking at things like psychosocial well-being, and they're looking at unemployment, and they're looking at transport and food security. So it's really trying to think across the city as to how do we build a stronger city. And so I just wanted to kind of think about the resilience principles in terms of the drought and what has come out since the drought in terms of strengthening our resilience. So in terms of maintaining diversity and redundancy, I've talked about that before. So one of the characteristics is systems with many components are more resilient than few. And so we were reliant on dams. And so now the city has diversified its water source to include more groundwater, reuse, and they're looking at desalination. Foster complex adaptive system thinking. The characteristics are that there are multiple connections in socio-ecological systems, and you need to be thinking of these different parts. You need to accept uncertainty and acknowledge that there are multiple perspectives. There are different ways of seeing the problem. There's not just one way of seeing the problem. And so before the drought, climate change was acknowledged but really wasn't adequately integrated in the planning, and there was a lack of recognition of multiple perspectives. And so post the drought, I think there's definitely been an improvement in both the data quality and modelling, and including climate in that. And I think that there's been a recognition of the importance of having multiple perspectives, but there's been insufficient attention and insufficient ability to bring in those multiple perspectives. So going forward, I think that's going to be a very important thing that we need to do, which is hard to do, but really important to get different groups and different ways of thinking. Actually, if you can integrate those, you get a more resilient system. And we've got to move towards that way of thinking that doesn't think, oh, the technocrats always know best. We need to encourage learning, which entails constantly revising our knowledge and stimulating learning. And there was very limited attention to how do we learn within the city before. And I think post the drought, there's a recognition of the importance of sort of revising knowledge and learning, but it's quite a hard thing to institutionalize. And I remember one of the Water Resilience Advisory Committee meetings I had sort of after, so it was during the 2018 rains, and I turned to one of the sort of senior guys who sort of manages the water distribution and the dams and in Cape Town. I says, wow, I said, have you sat down to think about what you've learned? He was like, I haven't had time for that. You know, so, I mean, obviously he had so much in him, but just the time and space to say, what have I learned? What are we doing? What do we need to change? That is becoming quite common practice in many organizations worldwide in terms of learning and flexible way of responding. There was such a need to just react and respond and get this sorted that there wasn't often that kind of support for learning. And often governments don't have that kind of environment where it's like, let's sit down, let's spend some time. So we had some really good dialogues with Peter Willis, who does conversations that count, and had these sort of safe spaces where we sat with sort of 15 or 20 of the senior people and said, let's just sit down, let's have space to reflect, to learn, to share, which is such an important part of this work that often feels like you don't have time for. And the last one in terms of broadening participation is building trust, and a shared understanding is what parts it contributes to, and it's actually really important for collective action. And so there were really limited opportunities to participate with the city before the drought. That's changing. I think the Section 80 committee was one way to do that. I think it was underutilized in a way, because it was such a crisis management response. The city were doing things, they'd share them with us, and we could make comments on it, but it wasn't really open to new ways of thinking. Whereas when they drafted the water strategy, they really had a bit more time. They said, let's get different people in, let's think about what they think is important, let's capture that, let's get comments. And so I think that's starting to happen, but it's still very hard for civil society, for local neighborhood organizations to know how they engage with the city and how that can be supported, a part of how the city works. And the reality going forward is to build resilient cities, everybody needs to be involved. We can no longer rely on government to sort it all out for us. The problems are becoming more complex and bigger, and we all need to play a role. So the government does need to facilitate that, and we need to be active citizens. We need to hold the government accountable and responsible, and we need to start getting involved. And so this lovely figure was from a 3-day workshop that I was lucky to attend, where we were thinking about a resilient, water-adapted city, and it was very creative, it was very innovative, there were all sorts of ideas that came out, and some of those went into the water strategy. So there's exciting stuff happening, and I think often it's hard to get a sense of that stuff because we don't know about it. But how do we encourage more people to be involved in this creative way of visioning a more adaptive city? So I'm going to leave with the question of, have we built a more adaptive city? And we can have some discussion in the last 10 minutes around, what do you think? Yes, no, parts? Yeah, thank you.
Sandparks and Cape Nature in the mix.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And part of that water fund as well. Yeah.
So could you enlarge on adding vegetation? A couple of years ago we had this dreadful fire in Nazi area. They should not call the Nazi area the garden route, they should call it the alien vegetation route, because that's what it is from one section to the next. And what is happening now? They're replanting alien vegetation. Now, what is the government actually doing? I remember years ago, Kara Ashwell, I think it was involved with alien vegetation eradication, and he was doing quite a good job. How good are they doing this now? Because the Department of Water Affairs, is too pure off the words, as you well know, is actually something happening about alien vegetation.
My understanding is that it's going much slower than it should be. And what it emerged is that the city of Cape Town actually pays a portion of the income it gets for water towards alien clearing or something like that. That's supposed to go into a big pot that's supposed to come back and clear, and it's not being done at the scale that it should be given the money that's going in. So I think there are serious challenges there.
I'm a keen hiker and I often walk on Table Mountain. And the appearance of alien vegetation, especially Port Jackson and this dreadful thing that comes from America, I mean, it's just absolutely taking over. You have no...
And I mean, that's the scary thing. The sooner you catch it, the easier it is. And once it starts taking over, it's just such a national parks.
Are we really taking this seriously, or is it just words?
So the Cape Town Water Fund, I know they really are taking it seriously, and they're focusing on certain areas, and they're sending teams in, I guess in part maybe because they couldn't rely on some of the teams who were supposed to be doing it before. But I don't know if you've got more input too.
Ask a different question that may have been covered in the previous lecture. But in terms of talking about resilience,
yes,
I think one of the things is how each citizen makes provision for their water supply and the possibility of enhancing that by capturing water.
Absolutely.
What is the policy in terms of encouraging people to have tanks, etc.?
Yes.
And if necessary, some sort of subsidy or relief in terms of what that
So we did actually speak about that yesterday, and there, as far as I know, there are no policies saying you should have a water tank because of some of the challenges that go with it in terms of treating that water. One of the things that I find very interesting when thinking about resilience, and yes, we need to build individual resilience, is the trade-offs between individual resilience and community, collective, system resilience. And I think the groundwater example is a lovely way to look at it. I want to be resilient myself. I sink a borehole in my home if I can afford it and have the water, but that's drawing down the table for everybody else and maybe decreasing the resilience of the community. So how do we get people to invest in the commons and make sure we're all looking after a resource that we can all use? But yes, I think part of that is encouraging rainwater tanks, encouraging water-wise gardens. There were discussions with the city around would they subsidise rainwater tanks. and they said they wouldn't, and I can't remember their reasoning, but yeah, they did subsidise the solar water geysers at one point, so, you know, but I think again it comes to, if they're subsidising something, they're saying, please go ahead and do it, and then they need to provide the support for how you manage it. And I think with water there are a lot of concerns around safe and health issues, safety and health, because of water quality and managing it. So,
well, one of the things we know is that water can continue to be used for some sort of gardening aspect. So maybe
exactly.
But that takes pressure off the system.
Exactly. Makes so much sense.
And I asked the question because I spent some time in Melbourne, and one of the things that struck me was the size of the